My name is Leslie. I joined HITRUST in April, and I want to talk a little bit about myself first before we move on. I came from the Department of Defense. I've spent some time in offensive cyber as well as in cyber policy at DoD. I'm still in the Army. I'm an Army major. So it's nice to meet all of you, for those of you who don't know who I am. Our agenda for today is first, I'm going to define ransomware. It's important to get on the same page as far as a definition because ransomware has become ubiquitous. So I want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what ransomware is. Then I will talk about, oh, sorry, I have a cat. How ransomware is delivered and what happens when you become a victim. Also, we'll talk about what to do if you do become a victim. Hopefully it doesn't happen or hasn't yet happened to anybody here. But if you do become a victim, it's important to know what to do so that you can manage the fallout immediately. Then we'll talk about strategies for preventing an attack and strategies for mitigating an attack. Next slide, please. Ransomware defined. Okay. This definition comes straight from CISA, and we'll talk about CISA in just a minute if you don't know who they are, but I wanted to use their definition because they are the federal authority on ransomware for our nation. They define ransomware as a form of malware designed to encrypt files on a device, rendering that file and the systems that rely on those files completely unusable. Malicious actors then demand a ransom in exchange for decryption. But I want to add to this definition and explain that it's not just the encryption of those files. They dump those files on the internet. Just this morning, I got an email from the HITRUST, which if you guys are not part of it, you should look into it. We can talk about that later if you guys have questions. They sent a list, an Excel spreadsheet of more than 2,500 companies whose companies have been attacked by ransomware, and that data was dumped online. And these companies who do the ransomware attacks, they're proud of it, and they post lists of the companies that they have hit and the data files associated with those ransomwares. So it's not just that your company is rendered totally frozen for the impact of the attack. Your data is put online. Sometimes it's sold, sometimes it's free, but that's the other side of ransomware that you want to make sure that you're not a victim of. Next slide, please. Okay, so who is CISA? CISA is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Agency, which is part of DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security. CISA was established in 2003, and they have had the rose pinned on them for our nation's, for securing our nation's infrastructure, both physically and in cybersecurity. I think people lose sight of their physical security requirements, but they also do physical in addition to cybersecurity. And the reason why I'm bringing up CISA, not just because they have a cool definition, but because they have this website. It's the link is on the bottom of this slide. You can also Google it and get there pretty quickly. But they have this website, more than one website. They have a ton of resources out there for ransomware. It's cisa.gov/stop ransomware. The guidance that I'm about to give and talk about on this presentation came from CISA, and I wanted to make sure that our guidance is in line with CISA's guidance because they have purview into a whole lot of additional information that we in the private sector don't have. They have the inner workings of any attacks that have happened. So I wanted to make sure that I bring that into this presentation because they have a ton of great resources that I want to make sure everybody is aware of. Next slide, please. Okay, how ransomware is delivered and what happens when you become a victim. Next slide. There are three main delivery mechanisms by which malware enter your system. These are not the only vectors of attack, but these are the three primary ones and the biggest and easiest targets, quite frankly. So the first one is an email phishing campaign, what I like to call the human vulnerability. And humans are generally the largest vulnerability in any network. And most attacks come through phishing. Those phishing emails, they can look innocuous, like they're from your bank. Hey, click here, we need to reset your password, or you've won $1 million. Sometimes email phishing campaigns are called whale phishing. They are whales. They're going after a particular person that they know has access to certain files. So they send very targeted email campaigns that they believe that a person is more likely to click on. For example, if somebody is super into Bitcoin, they might send you some really interesting Bitcoin emails telling you to click here. But what they're using is social engineering. So convincing somebody to click on a link when they know that they shouldn't click on links, right? Like we're all told every year during our cybersecurity awareness training not to click on links. But this email looks really convincing and sounds really interesting. So I'm just going to click here that one time. But that one link could be what causes your whole company to come under a ransomware attack. The next vector is the remote desktop protocol, or it's called RDP vulnerabilities. That's the technical way of saying remoting into your network. So if you have ever worked remotely from home, from a Starbucks, from a hotel room, and you are accessing your company's network from your personal device or from their device that they've issued you, that's considered an RDP process. And vulnerabilities in that access mechanism are also ways that ransomware enters your network. And then also software vulnerabilities, either through zero-day exploits, which means that there is a vulnerability in a software or hardware that the developer themselves, the manufacturer, has not yet discovered, but hackers have. They exploit that until the developer realizes it, creates a patch, and then sends out the patch. Those patches can come in, an email that says, here's a patch your vulnerability. Or it can also come in a routine update. I don't know how many people have iPhones out there, but Apple will send out, updates randomly, and it says that they are, updating multiple things. And then usually at the bottom of that list, it says they're patching some known vulnerabilities. So always install those manufacturer updates. 0 days, it's hard to defend against because there's no defense. We didn't know about it. But known vulnerabilities, there's really no excuse to be exploited through a known vulnerability, yet most of the exploits are delivered through known vulnerabilities because people just don't patch them. Next slide, please. So what happens when you become a victim? Can you advance the slide once? Yep. Okay, so these examples, and you can click it one more time. Yep. So these 3 examples I pulled from CISA's website because when you become a victim, you can contact FBI and CISA, and they will help you walk through it. So they get all of the inside baseball information for these attacks. So I wanted to put these up here to show you how it's not just your company goes offline for a little bit, or that just one system is impacted. So the first example, the far back box, is about a US county who is infected by a ransomware. It took off all of the systems that the county had. They had backups, which is great. That's a best practice. However, the backups were not sufficiently segregated from their network, and they were also impacted. So they not only lost their systems, they lost their backup files. So they thought that they were prepared, and it turns out they were prepared because they had not sufficiently implemented the controls to mitigate the impact of an attack. The second U.S. county system was infected. The attackers demanded a $1.2 million ransom for the decryption key. The county decided not to pay the ransom and decided to build it back from scratch. And they said that they were impacted because a singular employee, decided to click on a link from a company computer, which impacted their whole systems, resulting in lots of money being spent on rebuilding it. And then this third U.S. city was infected by ransomware, and the attackers got in through out of date. Out of date is another term for unpatched, non-maintained software and hardware. So oftentimes when out of dates, your out of date devices, your manufacturers will let you know maybe a year ahead of time, 6 months ahead of time, but they'll definitely let you know that they are no longer planning to maintain those systems and devices. And you may think that that's okay, like we'll just use old equipment, but that also means that they're not going to patch it. So when a vulnerability is discovered, you're stuck with those vulnerabilities until you get something new. So don't keep out of date systems and devices unless you have other measures to ensure that those vulnerabilities are going to stay with just those devices. And again, this ransom was not paid, but it cost them $9 million to rebuild their entire system. So ransomware, it's not just a short-term immediate pain point. It can be long-term, it can be very expensive, and it can be caused by very simple overlooks, which is why I say humans are the biggest vulnerability in a system. It's because humans decided to click a link or not buy new equipment or not patch the equipment that they did have. Next slide, please. Okay, so what to do if you become a victim? Next slide. This is kind of like a car crash, right? Like when you first get into a car crash, you're kind of shocked that it all happened. And the very first thing that you do is you kind of look around and say, am I okay? What's not okay? My car isn't okay. So you want to detect and analyze, and there's multiple steps that you should go through in the event of a ransomware attack. The very first thing is to determine which systems were impacted and then immediately isolate them. The reason why you want to isolate them is because malware can spread throughout your entire network. If you don't have a zero trust architecture, then it's very easy for the malware to spread. And the way to isolate them is number two, is to shut them down. Malware cannot spread on devices that are turned off. If you remember the oil pipeline being shut down, the 5,500 miles of oil pipeline was shut down because the oil company was not sure that those pipeline systems were sufficiently segregated from the network that was impacted. So they shut it down just to be safe. So that's why you need to make sure that your security controls are implemented properly, which means segregating networks, IT, and OT, so that in the event that you are hit in one system, you're confident that it's separated from a separate system. But if you're not confident, shut it all down and then until you figure out what's going on. Then you want to take the impacted systems and triage them to see what backups you have. Can I recover? What's going on? Like kind of like you're doing first aid. You're doing first aid on the battlefield. You know, impacts. Can we save this limb, or are we going to have to do something else? Next, you're going to want to consult with your incident response team. And yes, everybody should have an incident response team, whether you're a very small company or a large multinational corporation. Small companies probably have an outsourced company to help with some IT. You know, medium-sized companies potentially have it in-house or have some part outsourced. But you always want to make sure that you have an incident response team. Right now, you may not call them an incident response team, but you do have people that would be responsible for some of these activities, and so you will want to consult with them to determine what to do next. You'll need to tell them what you know. They'll be able to go and look at some things and determine what they can see and what they know, but you'll want to make sure that you work with them and that you have an incident response plan, and we'll talk about that towards the end. Next, you'll want to engage your internal and external teams and stakeholders with an understanding of what they can provide to help you mitigate, respond to, and recover from the incident. So if you have outsourced stakeholder or outsourced teams that you need to let know what is going on, definitely let your internal team know, let your leadership know, because these types of incidents, depending on who your customers are and who your clients are, could have other implications. Number 6, which is report incidents as required. So if you are a government contractor and you're housing controlled unclassified information, and some of that CUI, the controlled unclassified information, happens to be part of that ransomware system, you're going to have to report it. You also have to report under HIPAA as well. So make sure that when you are getting with your incident response team and telling your internal and external stakeholders, you'll need to know the type of data, which data was impacted by this ransomware, because depending on if the information was encrypted or not depends on if it is deemed that the information has been exploited. You'll have to get all of that information and have as much of that information as quickly as possible, especially under DFARS. You have to report within 72 hours of detecting that incident. So just make sure you keep all of this stuff in mind. Again, if you forget this information, go to CISA's website. They have a step-by-step checklist of what to do should you become a victim. And you can access CISA from your cell phone if all of your networks are down and you can't get on a company computer. Next slide, please.
Hey, Leslie, there was a question in relation to number 1.
Okay.
They were asking why the need to isolate or shut down. How can it spread to other systems?
Yeah, so malware is designed to spread like a virus, like a human transmissible virus. So it will look for any level of access to it that it can gain to devices like on the same level, but it'll also look for elevated accesses, and it will try to transmit and go everywhere in the network. So you need to shut it down so that it does not spread, because it's designed to spread and go everywhere and be as painful as possible to the network. That answers it, hopefully. Okay, so if recovery isn't possible, And again, this is from CISA's website. So if you want additional information for any of this, their Stop Ransomware website is phenomenal. But you want to take a system image and memory capture of the affected devices, your workstations and your servers, and if a phone potentially is impacted. But you'll want to take an image of that so that you can help. So probably not you, but your team or somebody you bring in can do a post-mortem of exactly what happened, the exact data that was compromised, and that you want to figure out exactly what happened. This is like a crime scene, right? So if you think about ransomware kind of in the same way that a traditional kidnap and ransom works, you'll want to save the crime scene, because that's what the forensics teams are going to do, is they're going to want to see exactly what happened, when it happened, how it got in, how it got out, when it got in, when it got out, and what the whole thing looks like. You'll want to collect relevant logs, security logs from your firewall, security logs from your other systems. Those things sometimes get overwritten with new logs, so you want to make sure that you preserve all of those things in a timely manner so that they're not inadvertently written over or anything like that. Again, this is a crime scene, so you'll want the evidence. These logs are kind of like security footage of a building where you have a camera and it monitors who goes in and out of the building, and if a murder happens in the building, they know who was in and who was out. So those logs are very, very relevant to conducting the forensic analysis of what happened. And again, this is very much a crime, so consult your federal law enforcement agencies, the FBI and CISA, because they will, one, walk you through what to do, but they can also help you find decryptors if there are decryptors available on the internet, decryptors being what you need to unlock your systems. But again, just because you have a decryptor, whether you pay for it or the FBI or CISA has a decryptor, it doesn't mean that your data is necessarily prevented from making its way to the dark web for either purchase or for free consumption from from everybody else, which is another reason why you need to understand the data that was impacted, because you could probably assume that whatever data was impacted has made its way to the dark web, and so you'll need to do an impact analysis and figure out who needs to be notified of that information, because now an adversary has that information. Next slide, please. Okay, how to mitigate the impact of an attack. Next slide. So I want to introduce everybody to the HITRUST CSF threat catalog. So the first and foremost, we want to prevent a ransomware attack, right? We don't want to have to mitigate the impact of an attack. First and foremost, we want to prevent it. So how do we prevent it? The best way to prevent a ransomware attack is to have a robust cybersecurity program. Cool. So what is a robust cybersecurity program? Well, a cybersecurity program is nothing more than a set of controls, a set of things that you do to prevent bad things from happening on your network. Okay, cool. So I need a list of controls, but what list of controls do I need, right? There are hundreds of frameworks out there. There's HIPAA, there's NIST, NIST 853, NIST 800-171, ISO, all of these things, right? Like, how do I know which one that I need? And do I need all of them? Do I need some of them? Right. And I guess the answer is it depends, right? It depends on what industry you're in. If you're in the healthcare industry, then HIPAA, parts of HIPAA will apply to you. If you're a federal contractor, then NIST 800-171 and potential NIST 853. Okay, cool. So I can't help you with determining your total cybersecurity program, but this HITRUST threat catalog can help you pick additional controls that may fall outside of the controls you're required to have because of the nature of your industry. If you want to incorporate controls into your program that are specific to the ransomware threat or other threats, the HITRUST threat catalog has hundreds of potential threats identified. It's an exhaustive list of potential threats to your network, whether it's adversarial, logical, or inadvertent threats. And I took a clip of it on the screen. So the far right-hand side is just the first three columns. They obviously have hundreds of more columns with all of the various threats. But I'll list the threat, and then I'll put an X in the row for the control that helps you mitigate that threat. So for the next few slides, I apologize, the slides look a little dry, but we'll talk through them so that hopefully they're not so dry. But each of these controls that I'm about to talk through will help you mitigate specifically the threat of ransomware. Now, some of these controls will probably hopefully already be in your cybersecurity program, but I'm going to foot stomp on them to reiterate how important they are specifically for the ransomware threat. Also, so the threat catalog here, it's fairly, if you're not used to looking at cybersecurity frameworks, this is going to look overwhelming. So for the next few slides, I kind of streamlined some of the columns to make it less confusing. So here on this slide, you're going to see the control category, the objective number, control number, control name. Some of that stuff is not super important, so I'm going to cut that out so we can get straight to the meat of the controls for what you should be implementing to specifically reduce the threat of ransomware. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so these next two slides, they're all going to look like this. They have a chart on them. They are categorized by domain. Domain is the far left column. Then the control name, which control name is not necessarily important. It's just a name given to the control specification. The control specification is the important meat and potatoes of what you need to be doing to really get the effect that you're looking for, which is reducing your risk of being subject to a ransomware attack. So the first thing on this list is Information Security Management Program. You should have an information security management program. It's kind of hard to do any of the other things if you don't have a program in place, which means it needs to have buy-in from your leadership. It needs to be managed. It needs to be monitored. It needs to be maintained. It needs to be funded. It needs to be resourced. It needs to have people, and it needs to have buy-in. So you can't do anything else on this list if you don't have an information security management program. So it sounds obvious, but I wanted to make sure to hammer home that without a full program that's funded and resourced and has buy-in, none of this is going to work because you can have policies all day long, you can have technical controls all day long, but if no one listens to them or follows them or buys into them, then they're essentially useless. So the next domain I want to talk about is asset management. I think a lot of people overlook this, and it sometimes gets overlooked if you start out as a small business and then you grow quickly into a large company. You may lose sight of your assets or your asset management. This means having inventory of your assets, inventorying all of your servers, your desktops, your laptops, your mobile devices. If you allow mobile devices on your network, you need to have an inventory of all of those assets. Who do they belong to? Where are those people sitting? What type of information do they have? Like, make sure you maintain an asset, because this will help when you're hit with ransomware. You'll need to know everybody's assets who were impacted by this, because they all touch company information, and so you'll need to understand the type of information that has been impacted because the assets have been impacted. Ownership of assets. The acceptable use of assets. So every company should have an acceptable use policy, which details to their employees what they may and may not do with their company devices. It sounds like a no-brainer, but some employees may not understand that they shouldn't be shopping online all day or checking their personal email, because your email server could be very well protected, but if somebody's checking their Gmail and clicks on a spam link from their personal email, it can impact your entire system because they're using their personal email on your system. So you'll want to develop your acceptable use of your company assets and explain those to your employees, and probably make them sign some sort of agreement or attend some training where you explain what the acceptable uses are. And then classification guidelines. So if you are a federal contractor or you work with government information, a lot of that is already done for you. Controlled unclassified information, classified information, secret, top secret, confidential, those things. But if you don't work for the government or don't support government or control government information, you'll want to have something similar for your own information. If you handle PII, personally identifiable information, that is a sensitive type of information that's a little bit different than, say, company internal communications about federal holidays or something, right? So you want to have and understand your different classifications of information within your company, so that if you are hit by ransomware on one part of your network and not another, you'll want to know, is this where my PII is stored, or is this where, our marketing stuff is stored? And not that marketing is not important, but it's probably less sensitive than the social security numbers of all of your employees. So asset management as a domain is very important because it will help you understand the totality of an attack if you do happen to become a ransomware victim. Next slide, please. Access control. And I know these words are very small. I apologize. We don't have to talk. We're not going to talk about all of them, but I wanted to use this as an illustrative talking point to show you how important access control is as a domain and as a function in preventing malicious cyber actors into your network, not just for ransomware, but all malicious actors are looking to gain access to your network. And so access control is a very important function. It's generally the first control that pops up in a list of controls because it's an A, it's an AC. So it's always the first thing you talk through. It's also one of the longest domains with the most requirements. But you'll want to, first and foremost, want to make sure that you have an access control requirements that are formally established and documented and reviewed on a regular basis. You'll want to, even small companies, like, if you're to a two-person company, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but as you start adding 4, 5, 10, 20, 50, 100 employees, how are they granted access to your network? Can they bring their own device? If they do bring their own device, how do they get granted access to network assets? But document it and review it on a regular basis. Make sure it meets business processes. If it doesn't flow well with business processes, people aren't going to do it, so then it's not going to be implemented, and then it's not going to work. So make sure that your access control policy and program meets the needs of your business, but also that it's documented and explained and that people are following those rules. You'll want to have a way to register and deregister your employees or people who have access to your network. So when you grant people access to your network, make sure that you're removing that access if they no longer need access or if they transfer to a different office, different function. Make sure that you have a process in place for doing that, because that will help, again, when malware, ransomware, anything gets into your network, it's looking for ways to spread. And so if you keep everyone at the same access that they had when they first came on, but they're moving around and they get more access, and you never remove the previous access, then those viruses can spread very easily just because everyone still has those accesses. So make sure that you are controlling access to your network. That's what it's called, but that's the whole point of this domain. Let's see, segregation in networks. That's something we talked about earlier. This is an access control. So making sure that users and groups and functions are segregated where possible, a lot of cybersecurity consultants love to make things as difficult as possible, but not realizing the human factor that if you make things so difficult for your employees to access different things, they're just going to find ways to bypass it, like they're going to email it to their Google account instead of having to VPN into various parts of the network, right? So segregate your networks, but make sure that as you do all of these things that is aligned with your business processes. But also segregating your OT, your operational technology, and your IT environments where possible. That was the oil pipelines problem. They hadn't sufficiently segregated their networks, so they were afraid that the ransomware was going to spread to their OT environment, to their operational technology environment, and they shut it down out of just to be sure. Secure logon procedures also seems like a no-brainer, but you want to establish strong password requirements and enforce those secure password requirements, right? You can set a policy all day long, but if you're not enforcing it, either through a technical means or through some other sort of way, it's not going to mean anything. But having weak passwords are a way that reusing passwords also is another way that malicious cyber actors can get into a network. So create a policy and enforce that policy and make sure that your employees, your new employees, and your existing employees know those requirements. Let's see. One last thing I want to talk about before we leave access control is, let's see, limitation of connection times. So restrictions on connection times shall be used to provide additional security for high-risk applications. So this control is talking about high-risk applications, and high-risk applications have that high risk or that high-value information, right? The social security numbers. Not every application is high risk, so you don't necessarily need to have these types of controls on everything, but ensuring that you understand the type of data, where it is, and identifying those high-risk applications and having those additional controls for those applications will be very important to prevent ransomware from taking that high-risk information. Next slide, please. Okay, so I also wanted to highlight on this slide that cybersecurity is the responsibility of many different groups of people. It's not just your cybersecurity team, it's also your human resources. It's your compliance team. It's your everyday employee. Everybody's responsible for cybersecurity. So I think this slide is a great highlight of that even your human resources has a domain here to ensure that cybersecurity requirements are being met. So for human resources, you'll want to make sure that everybody in your company is trained on a regular basis, probably an annual basis, on cybersecurity. What are the threats that have popped up in the last year? Because threat actors evolve and adapt as we become harder targets to attack. They shift their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and protocol procedures for how they attack people. So we want to make sure that we're informing our employees with the most relevant, up-to-date information. And you also want to educate them on what their responsibilities are and their requirements are for being cyber secure, right? And then your human resources folks are also have some part of the process for removal of access rights. So while it's your IT team that may physically remove or go in and program the removal of access for somebody who leaves or changes jobs, but it's probably your HR team. It's probably their responsibility to notify the IT team potentially that so-and-so is not here, so please remove their access. So it requires two different teams of people to work together to make sure that one person has their access is updated as necessary. Security policy. You want to make sure that you have security policies in place, and not just having policies for the sake of having policies, right? Whether you're a chief information security officer or you're an IT person who's tasked with setting all of these writing down all these requirements, but if you don't have management buy-in and other stakeholder buy-in and employee buy-in, they're pretty useless. So it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have policies. Of course you should have policies, but they should be coordinated and communicated and talked about with all of the stakeholders involved. And you'll want to review those policies on a regular basis, at least annually, right? You'll want to make sure that what we had in place a year ago still meets the threat landscape of today, right? Did we, in the last year, get a new client and now we're handling controlled unclassified information, but we don't have multi-factor authentication on some of our network where that data is housed, like we need to do that. So make sure that not just say you have those policies, but that you're reviewing those policies on a regular basis and updating those policies on a regular basis to make sure that they're continuing to meet the requirements of your company, your threat landscape, all of those things. Organization of information security. So you want to identify risks related to external parties, right? So the information that you house is not, I don't know how many companies operate in a vacuum, right? You connect to external networks and you allow connections to external networks. You exchange information with various people. So you want to be sure to address those concerns with the people you're letting into your network and then the people who are letting you onto their network or with their information. So this is where HITRUST really has a lot of value add here. The whole HITRUST concept, our methodology, our reason for being is to provide assurances to third parties of the security of my information. So this whole domain is really where HITRUST bread and butter is. That's the whole goal of HITRUST. So this domain is great for HITRUST and making sure that you understand not just the security, the risk you're adding to someone else's network, but realizing that other people are adding risk to your environment as well. And so where are the lines drawn as far as responsibilities and those kinds of things? Very important with ransomware, because if you're allowing external connections to your network and somebody in that network, that other network is not secure, not as secure as you are, they could potentially introduce malware and ransomware to your environment inadvertently, because they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So make sure that you understand the risk of your third parties that you're exchanging information with. And then your compliance domain. So I took out some of the compliance controls that are relevant to ransomware specifically, because you want to, your company establishes policies, right? But how do you know if your employees are following them? You audit them, right? You ensure that people are complying with your policies. So whether that's announced or unannounced audits, but you want to make sure that you're checking up on all of the policies that your company has put in place to ensure that they have sufficiently mitigated their risk to malicious cyber actors. You'll want to make sure that the humans are doing it, as well as the technical configurations are what they say they are, right? So this is a little bit more complex, because you'll have to have somebody audit the technical controls, who is technical in nature, right? So whether you need to bring in a third party or you have an internal team, but make sure that if your policy says that after 15 minutes of inactivity, a user is logged out, make sure that that user is actually being logged out, and make sure that the technical configuration is there to support that policy. Because again, it's great to have policy, but if it's not implemented and it's not validated, then you might as well just not have it. Next slide, please. Okay, communications and operations management. This slide is another great illustrating the point that your whole company is responsible for cybersecurity. Communications and operations management, to me, that means what makes your business run. Everybody who's involved in making your business run has responsibilities in cybersecurity. So all of these controls are tied to data information sharing, right? Supplier service delivery is delivery is regularly monitored, reviewed, and audited. Again, so you want to make sure that what you're doing is monitored. The data you're sharing is monitored. You're reviewing the activity, and that you're auditing those activities to make sure that they are in line with your company policies. Controls against malicious code. So this is another way to say an antivirus. You'll want to have something installed on your network, on your machines, that have access to threat information, so that if any of those types of known files or executable files or malware, if they detect any of that, then you will be alerted, so that you can sandbox it or delete it, or make sure that you don't install it. But again, malware and antivirus software is only known malware and antivirus, right? So if it's another zero-day exploit, or they're not necessarily called zero-day, but if it's another new type of exploit or malware that hasn't been seen before, it won't be discovered. So antivirus is not the end-all be-all for cybersecurity. You can't just install that and say, hey, I'm good because I have antivirus. Well, if there's a new threat actor on the scene that hasn't been added to this database, then it's going to be able to operate with impunity on your network. Controls against mobile code. So mobile code, it's authorized, you're allowed to have it, but you need to make sure that you're conducting a security analysis around it before you introduce it to your environment. And then your network controls. You want to make sure that your network controls are managed and controlled to protect information in your systems and applications. So again, that's your IT team who's responsible for configuring your network controls, your firewall controls, those kinds of things. You'll need to make sure that they're actually doing them in accordance with your policies. So what you're saying you're doing, you're actually doing in practice. And again, you can validate that through auditing on a regular basis or semi-regular basis, announced or unannounced, but you want to make sure that what you say you're doing, you're actually doing. Next slide, please. Okay, and again, continuing with communications and operations management. These are, again, mostly set up by your IT team, but everybody in your company who does anything for your company, they're the ones impacted by these controls, right? So this is, these controls being put in place are logging and monitoring the use of the people using your systems. So your IT team has to put all of these technical controls in place to ensure that the daily use and activity on your network is controlled and logged properly and only functions within the authorized policies that you've established, the authorized security policies that you've established. So again, this is another side of a pair that you have to make sure, a pair being two, making sure that they go together. You have your policies that you've established, and then you've had your IT and network team implement all of those requirements, and you're logging the activity on your network so that you can go back if something does happen. You can go back and look at activity logs to see who accessed the system at what time and what were they doing, and those kinds of things that will help in the post-mortem should you be hit with ransomware or any other type of malicious actor. And then also clock synchronization. I know that seems really random to add here, but when you're doing a post-mortem on an incident, ensuring that your clocks are synced will help you understand your audit logs, right? Like if your server is on a different time than a desktop and you're wanting to figure out like what happened and when, but they're on different times, you'll never be able to marry those two things up. So if you are ensuring that your clocks are synchronized across your entire system, that will help in the event should you become a victim of a cyber attack. Next slide, please. System development and maintenance, right? So you'll want to make sure that you are using cryptographic controls. You want to encrypt your sensitive data in rest, in transit, all the time, right? End-to-end encryption, especially if you're a federal contractor and you handle CUI, it's a requirement. You must encrypt that type of information. But if you're not a federal contractor and you handle PII and other types of other sensitive information, make sure that you're encrypting it. Making sure that you are protecting the cryptographic keys, right? Because it would be really silly to have everything encrypted but then have the keys as a, saved on your desktop that's not encrypted, and anybody who gets into your desktop now has the keys to the kingdom, right? So you have to encrypt everything and then make sure you're protecting the keys. Also, outsource software development. I imagine most people outsource their software. I don't imagine most of the people on this call develop their own software, but if you do outsource it, make sure that you are asking questions about the security of the software or try to understand their secure software development process. If it's a reputable software vendor, it's probably okay. But if it's not a well-known, reputable software developer, ask those kinds of questions. Ask to see how it was developed. Then put it in a controlled environment so that you can test it and make sure that it's not running anything that it's not supposed to, or that it hasn't put some sort of secret backdoor into your network. But introducing new software to your environment is a risk, and you will want to mitigate that you will want to mitigate it, and it's not impossible. You just have to go through the steps to make sure that you're introducing something that's not going to introduce a backdoor for somebody to get into your network to put malware on your environment. And then management of technical vulnerabilities. So again, this is doing vulnerability scans or doing audits of your technical configurations, but all of the potential vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities, making sure you're patching everything, and then discovering vulnerabilities that you didn't know about, right? So making sure that you're doing that in a measured and methodical and logical way, so that's not ad hoc, that you're doing it on a regular basis to make sure that if I didn't catch it this time or something gets introduced, after I did my last one, I'm going to be doing it again. So I'm going to catch it on the next one. So next slide, please. Okay, so mitigating the impact of an attack. So the controls we talked about previously, most of them are geared towards preventing an attack. Like, we do not want an attack to happen, but in the event of an attack, next slide, please, these controls will help mitigate the impact. Information backup. We talked about this very early on, where there was a county in America who they had backups, which is great. the backups weren't segregated far enough, like sufficiently from the impacted network, so they were impacted during the attack. So your backups will need to be, golden images. They will need to be encrypted. They will need to be offline. They'll be sufficiently separated from your data in use, so that if your data in use is attacked, you will have that to restore your information. And you want to test that information and test that capability of restoring from backup. Because if you can't restore from backup, or the backup is 2 months old, yeah, you can back up some data, but it's 2-month-old data, and now you have to rebuild all of that information that you've lost between your backup time and the attack. Information security, incident management. You'll need to know reporting information security events, incident management program. You'll want to have an incident management program. So again, I talked about this earlier, that you want to have an incident response plan. You want to have an incident response team. So you need to know who to talk to when an event happens, because it's probably not going to, it may not necessarily be your IT team that discovers the ransomware, right? It could be your employee that comes in at 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. and turns on her desktop, and she can't because there's an incident. So she needs to know, who does she call at 6 o'clock in the morning to report this incident, and then who she calls, what did they do, right? So they should all have a game plan and know what to do. And then you'll want to have business continuity management, right? So in your incident response plan, you should know that you have backups. You should know how long it might take to have a backup. You should know who you report to. You should know how long, in theory, you should know how long the impacts to business operations will be in the event of a ransomware attack. So you'll want to plan it out, from, and I apologize for using military terms because I came from the DoD, but at the moment of boom, right, we want to know, right of boom, what happens. There's an attack person, you notify your security, your IT team, because they are your incident response team. They will then notify your leaders. The leaders will, they will know that everything will be offline for 6 hours until you can restore from backup. So you need to let your customers know, your stakeholders know that, hey, we're down, we've got it managed, and we are going to be back online as soon as possible. So you're making sure that you have a continuity of operations plan in place will definitely help you communicate to your stakeholders, internal and external, what's going on, what to expect, and when you will be back online and ready for business again. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to hammer home some of the key points. These are also taken from CISA, which align to everything that we've just talked about, but these are the key concepts that everyone should keep in mind as they try to prepare, hopefully not prepare for a ransomware attack, but in the event that one does happen, these are how to be prepared. Number one, be prepared, right? You prepare for the worst case scenario. You hope it doesn't happen, but in the event that it does, you want to make sure that you are prepared. Maintain offline encrypted backups of your data and regularly test it. Have these golden images of your data somewhere safe, somewhere they cannot be altered by malicious cyber actors, right? Like, you want to make sure it's encrypted and that it is totally removed and not subject to the same attack that the actual in-use data is. And then create, maintain, and exercise a basic cyber incident response plan. CISA has a great incident response plan on their website. So if you don't have one, or you're starting from scratch, or you want to reinvigorate yours, or you want to reevaluate what you're doing and what you should be doing, check out CISA's website. They have some excellent information, guidance for what you should be doing. But again, the key point here is be prepared. No one wants to be hit by an attack, but in the probably likely event that somebody on this call will be hit by a ransomware attack, you want to be prepared, because that will help you mitigate the impact of that attack. Next slide, please. Okay, develop and regularly update a comprehensive network diagram. This is very important. This is kind of like the blueprints of a building that is under attack, right? Like, you'll want to know the back stairwells, you want to know the crawl spaces, you want to know everywhere that's in your network, right? Because you want to be able to trace the impact of the ransomware attack. You'll want to know where the networks are segregated, where are your firewalls, where are your devices, where are your laptops, your desktops, potential mobile devices, servers. where are they, right? So you can trace logically where the virus, where the malware has potentially spread. And if you don't have that network diagram, it's anybody's guess to where you think that information goes. Employ logical or physical means of network segregation, segmentation to separate various businesses, unit or departmental IT resources. So again, the kind of goes hand in hand with the developing your network diagram, right? Like your network diagram also include those segregation of networks and have those segregation of networks because you don't want your whole company to be impacted by an incident that occurred on just one computer in one department. You want to make it as difficult as possible for these malwares and the viruses to spread across your entire network. And then ensure your organization has a comprehensive asset management approach. Again, we talked about this very early on. It was the first control, second control we talked about, group of controls, about maintaining, make sure that you maintain your asset inventory and that you understand your asset inventory, who owns which devices, where are they sitting. This is part and parcel of your network diagram, right? These documents will absolutely help you understand the impact of an attack, understand how to repair your network after an attack, and to understand the totality of the impact of the attack. Because without this information, you're going to be scrambling and not know how to respond, and it's going to take you a whole lot longer to rebuild. If you have to rebuild your entire network, you'll at least have this in place to know what you have to rebuild. So be prepared, I think, is the main point in this. Mitigating the impact is to be prepared. You'll have far less impact to your organization, your company, your network if you are prepared for it. No one wants to have it happen, but it could happen. So make sure you're prepared for it. Next slide, please. Yep, that's the end.
Great. Thanks, Leslie. I just want to remind everyone, you may submit written questions using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send. Please keep the drop-down as all panelists. We do have a few questions, and we have a little bit of time. So, Leslie, the first one, does CISA provide any guidance on whether or not to pay a ransom, or does it depend if the attacker is on the OFAC sanctions list?
Do not pay. I think the guidance like a couple years ago was to pay or maybe pay or not say if you're going to pay. And insurance has been paying. Some insurance companies will pay the ransom, but the FBI guidance is do not pay. These are terrorists. We don't negotiate with terrorists because if you pay them, they're just going to be emboldened to do it again. So do not pay. Call the FBI. Treat this like a real world like human crime because it is. It's a crime, and we shouldn't be paying ransomware. Don't pay them.
Okay. Another question regarding mitigation. Should and how do you create relationships with FBI so they know who and you are and when you're having an incident?
Sure. So I know CISA's website has a link to report an incident, and I'm pretty sure the FBI does, but I do not claim to know how the FBI does those, but I'm pretty sure the FBI has a reporting portal where you can go and tell them. So they take this very seriously. So from what I understand, these agencies respond very quickly to reporting because it's critical to national security and it's a crime. So I don't think there's like a 911 number you call for the FBI, but I'm pretty sure there's an online portal or resource that you can click a link and submit at least a form. There might even be a 1-800 number, but I don't know if it's like an immediate response, like, FBI, how can I help you today with, mitigating this threat? But there's definitely ways to report it through official channels to them so that they know that you are reporting a ransomware attack or a cyber attack.
Sure. What about cyber insurance? When do they get notified, and will the insurance company influence actions?
Yeah, I imagine it's policy to policy. A couple years ago when I was first researching about cyber policies, they weren't doing any sort of risk analysis on companies, but from what I understand now, insurance companies are doing like a risk assessment on companies before they insure them. And I'm fairly certain that your insurance company will tell you exactly how long you have to report it, what their process and procedures are, because that will determine how much they pay or if they pay. So I imagine it's company to company, your insurance. And again, some will pay ransomware and some won't. I don't know if more of them are being dissuaded from paying the ransom because it's not saving your data. Your data is still going onto the dark web and being sold or given away to malicious cyber actors. The only thing you're really paying for is that crypto key to unlock your data. So that's why, yes, inform your insurance company if they ask you to or tell you that you have to if you want to be covered. But also report to CISA and the FBI because they may have the decryption key that you may not have to pay for.
Okay, there's quite a few questions here. I'm just kind of reading through some here. Can you address some of the hidden costs of attacks, such as brand erosion, loss of customer?
Yeah, I mean, those are all valid points. Not just brand erosion. I think some companies have done a good job of rebuilding their brand post attack, but loss of confidence in the data, right? From your partners, your suppliers, or your customers. Also, if you are a federal contractor and you have a breach and it's determined that the breach was caused because you didn't have the right security controls in place, but you've been attesting to having these controls in place, now the government can sue you for False Claims Act violation, right? Like, so be aware of what contracts you're signing with whom and what your security requirements are, because they sometimes will tell you what you have to have in place. Like, you need to be compliant with NIST 853. And if you're signing the contract, you're saying that you're compliant. So if you're hit by ransomware because you didn't have antivirus or something on your computer or something very simple that is an overt control that is very obvious and you just didn't have that in place, now you can be sued by a client potentially. So not just your your brand awareness and erosion and general trust in your company, but now you can be sued. So cybersecurity compliance is now a contractual obligation in some cases. So that's another I wouldn't say hidden cost, but a potential really scary situation for a company.
I think we have time for one more question. Which U.S. authorities would be required to be notified in case of any security incident leading to a breach?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a requirement to report unless you're required under HIPAA, unless you're required under the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement or some other federal contract or federal, I don't even think critical infrastructure, which CISA protects critical infrastructure. I don't even think they have a legal requirement to report. I mean, it says they should report, and the executive orders that Biden has signed this year, are aiming to protect critical infrastructure, but I don't know if there is a legal requirement that mandates that they report, right? It's a you should report. And I guess if, your cat is kidnapped, you don't have to call FBI, but you could, because they could help you. And why wouldn't you want to report it? I understand reporting could lead to media coverage over it, or the broader public being aware of an incident. But I would say don't hesitate to report. CISA is not going to do anything bad to you. FBI is not going to hold you responsible and blame you or charge you any money for it. So there's really no reason not to report it, because they're just going to help you. And same with DOD and the DFARS reporting, right? You're supposed to report any incident to DOD CIO within 72 hours. And a lot of people are afraid that they're going to get in trouble, right, from DOD. But DOD really wants to help do a postmortem and help to understand the malicious cyber actor and what they were doing and why they were there and what they wanted to get out of it. So I would say report out of getting free resources, because why not? They're going to help you in some way, whether get the decryption key or to help you with the postmortem and understand who that threat actor was.
Thanks, Leslie. I think that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I just want to remind everybody that we will be sending a follow-up email that will include a link to the presentation deck and a recording of this webinar, which will also be on the HITRUST website, and you should see that within 24 to 48 hours after today's event. Thank you all for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.